Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom, welcome back to today's Daf Yomi Shabbos, Daf Lamed Vav, on Daf Lamed Hey Amud Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. Says the Gemara, Elo mokim tzanua, yesh le lechazan hakneses, b'roish gagoy. The Brisa is concluding the description of the 6 tkiyos, the blows of the shofar, which would be sounded by the Chazan HaKnesses, as Rashi calls him, the Shamash HaTzibur, the attendant who would climb up high on the roof to sound the alarm, to inform everybody about the upcoming Shabbos. And the Brisa concludes that he places the shofar up there on the roof. He has a Makam Tzanua, concealed place there, B'roish Gagay, up on the roof, Shesham Maniach Shofar. There he would place his shofar and keep it there through Shabbos. Why? Why can't he simply bring it home with him through the Rosh Hashanah? Lefi, concludes the Brisa, Lefi she'em metaltlin, one may not move lo yesai shofar v'lo esach hatzotzros. He cannot move a shofar or the trumpets. Why? Because these are items that are muktzah on Shabbos. They are kelim shemelachtam le'isr. They're designated for malachis, to use it to blow, to sound, to make a sound, and therefore it is muktzah. He must leave it up on the roof and go retrieve it afterwards. Says the Gemara, is that so? That a shofar is muktzah v'atani, but haven't we learned in the Brisa? Shofar metaltal. A shofar can be moved on Shabbos, it's not muktzah. V'chatzotzros eina metaltlan. But trumpets are indeed muktzah. So this Brisa differentiates between a shofar, which is not muktzah, and a trumpet, which is. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yosi lo kasha. It's not difficult. It depends on what type of shofar. Kan be yachid, kan be tzibur. If it's a shofar which belongs to an individual, that shofar is not muktzah, since it can be used for a shimish heter. It can be used for a permissible function on Shabbos. Rashi explains, a shofar is curved, and one can use it to fill it with water and feed a baby, use it as a baby bottle. So therefore, it's not muktzah. But a shofar which belongs to the congregation, to the tzibur, is considered to be muktzah. Amalei Abaye, what difference does it make who it belongs to? Or b'yachid l'maychaz, if it belongs to a yachid, why? What is it suitable for? It is suitable. We can use it for legamei b'mayim latina. We use that as a baby bottle to feed the child, feed the baby. So since it has a shimush heter, one may move it on Shabbos. Since it's not completely designated for melechas iser, so you can use it for the melechas heter, for the shimush heter. Says Zumar b'tzibur nami, ruchayza legamei latinik ani. Even if it belongs to the tzibur, it can also be used for the same function, to be used as a baby bottle for a tinik ani, a poor baby, as Rashi says, shalat tzibur lefarnesai, which the tzibur has a responsibility to feed. So even a shofar which belongs to a tzibur can be used for a shimush heter. So what difference does it make if the shofar belongs to a yachid or a tzibur? V'su another kasha. Hadasani, how are we going to explain the following brisa, which says, Kashem shemetaltlan es shofar. Just like you may move the shofar, and it's not muktzah, kach metaltlan es chatzotzros. So to the trumpets are not muktzah. Mani, who is this brisa? Whose shita is this brisa following? Who's the author of this brisa? Elo, you must say as follows. We have a 3-way contradiction. We have 3 brisas, each one is stating a different halacha. One brisa says, a shofar and a trumpet are not muktzah. One brisa which says directly the opposite. Both are muktzah. The other brisa differentiates, says a shofar it's not muktzah, a trumpet is. This is how we're going to explain the brisas. Like kasha, it's not difficult. They're all following different opinions. Ha Rab Yehuda, ha Rab Shimon, ha Rab Nechemya. One is following the sheet of Rab Yehuda, who says, well, a trumpet, that's muktzah. Why? Although one technically perhaps can use it for a shimush heter, can find some permissible function to use it for, but since its primary designation, its overwhelming use, its broad use is for shimush itzer, by and large the trumpet is used for making sounds, which is isser on Shabbos. Therefore, even if you can perhaps find some sort of shimush heter, it's considered to be negligible in contrast to the overwhelming broad use, which is isser. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, a trumpet is muktzah. A shofar is different, since it may very well be used as a baby bottle for a child. So that's not muktzah. That explains the brisa, which is machalak, differentiates between a shofar, which is not muktzah, and a chatzoitzes which is muktzah. A shofar is not, a trumpet is. The Brisa which says that both are not muktzah, it's following Shittas Rav Shimon, who says, just as a shofar can be used for a shimish heter, and therefore it's not muktzah, a trumpet as well, if you would like to use it for a shimish heter, it's not muktzah. And the concept of muktzah doesn't apply in this case. Rav Shimon agrees that something which is completely unsuitable, like a rock, that certainly is muktzah on Shabbos, but he maintains that a trumpet, it can be used, it's a kli, and it can be used for heter. We can find a permissible function for it, and therefore it's not muktzah. You can use it for that shemish heter on Shabbos. Reb Mechemya holds a very unique shita, that a kli can only be used on Shabbos if he's using it for the primary designated use of this kli. For instance, a knife, only to cut with it. He can't use it for something else. So therefore, these things, shofar, chatzotzres, they're meant to be used for malachas iser, not for to be used as a baby bottle, etc. Therefore, according to Rechemya, these kalim are muktzah on Shabbos. So once again, Rechemya holds that a kli can only be used for its designated purpose. A knife to cut, for instance, food, etc. Something which it's designated for, but not a shofar to be used as a baby bottle, etc. So once again, like Kasha, Harab Yehuda, Harab Shimon, Harab Rechemya. Says the Gemara, okay, so we understand the Brisa which tells us that you cannot be metaltal a shofar, a chatzotzres, it's following Shittas Rav Chemya. Now let's take a closer look at the sequence of the Brisa. You can't be metaltal a shofar, velo is a chatzotzres, not the trumpets. Now why is the Brisa listed in this order? It would seem that what is a greater chiddush? It's a greater chiddush to state that a shofar, which it is used as a baby bottle as well, even that is muktzah on Shabbos, since its primary designated use is for blowing, which is a malacha. So why does the Brisa begin with shofar, which is a greater chiddush? The Brisa should have begun with chatzotzres. Brisa should have said a trumpet is muktzah, and even a shofar. Not only a chatzotzres, which by and large the chatzotzeres, the trumpet, is used for malachas iser, its malachas heter is negligible, and therefore it's muktzah. Not only that is muktzah according to Rechemya, even a shofar, which has a heter designation, it's used as a baby bottle as well. Even that is muktzah. That is a greater chiddush. Even that's muktzah, since using it as a baby bottle is not its primarily designated use, and therefore it's muktzah. So the Brisa should have said in the reverse: we may not be metaltel not only a chatzitzeres, but even a shofar. Says the Gemara, "Oh my shofar, nami chatzotzres." When the Brisa says you cannot be metaltel according to Rechemya a shofar, it's actually speaking about trumpets. My shofar nami chatzotzres, and the Brisa is simply switching around the terms. Because as Rav Chizda told us, there are some things that their names, the designations, got switched around after the Churban Beis Hamikdash. Before we proceed to Rav Chizda, let's just make a quick summary here of the three Brises, the three Shittas. According to Rav Yehuda, a shofar can be used for a tashmish heter, but not a chatzotzres, not those trumpets. According to Rav Shimon, both may be used. According to Rav Chemya, both may not be used on Shabbos, since its primarily designated use, its yichud, is for tashmish of iser. Therefore, you cannot use those items for other uses on Shabbos, even if it's going to be a tashmish of heter. So Rav Chizda proceeded and told us that there are three things. Hanit lasmili, these three items, ishtani shmayu, their names were changed, were switched around Mechichar Beis Hamikdash from the time of the Churban Beis Hamikdash. What are these three things? Number one, chatzotzrasa, a trumpet, was given a new name. It was called shofar, a shofar. A shofar, what used to be called a shofar, a horn, was given a new name, chatzotzrasa, a trumpet. So those two were switched around, and indeed that explains the Brisa. The Brisa which says you cannot be metaltal loyasai shofar, it was really referring to a trumpet, which indeed is a lesser chiddush. And the Brisa concludes not only a shofar, but even a chatzotzres, even the trumpets. But it's not referring to a trumpet, it's referring to a shofar. And that is a greater chiddush. Even that, which is meant to be used also as a baby bottle, is not to be used on Shabbos, is muktzah, according to Rechemya. So once again, the Chatzotzos, the trumpet, were given a name shofar. The shofar was given a name Chatzotzos. L'may nafkamina. What is the difference? What is the halachic ramification of this switchover? Why do we need to know this? It says more very simple. A shofar shalosh Hashanah, because on shofar we meant to use a horn. So we're meant to know what exactly is the word shofar referring to. In order to be yotze on Rosh Hashanah, to fulfill our obligation, we need to use the item which today is called a trumpet, which indeed is a shofar. So that's the first item on the list. The second thing was arava, the willow, which was used in the lulav. So what used to be called arava is today called tzafzafa, which is actually a different type of species related to the arava, which is actually not kosher, not suitable to be used in the lulav. Rashi explains the leaves are round, the stems are white. So the term tzafzafa actually originally was referring to a species which is not suitable for lulav, but today it was switched around. The kosher willow is referred to with the word tzafzafa. And tzafzafa, what used to be called a tzafzafa, today is called arava. L'may nafkamina, what is the nafkamina here? The lulav. Simple. What is meant to be put into the lulav? We're meant to use the item which today is called tzafzafa, which is the real arava. Psoira, a large table. What used to be referred to as a large table, as psoira, is called psarta. A large table today is called psarta. Psarta, a small table, which initially was called psarta, is today referred to as psoira. What is the difference here? For business transactions, one who commits to selling a psarta, in today's terms, he's meant to give him a large table, because a large table today is referred to as psarta. And so, very interesting pshat. Why indeed did they switch these things around? It was meant to make a zikar and a zecher lemigdash. The Gemara tells us that one is meant to make a zecher to keep the Beis Hamikdash fresh in our minds and hearts, and make a memorial for the Beis Hamikdash. Set down a zecher. So, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, during the taniyos, during the fast days, they would blow with a trumpet. Today we don't have that any longer. So, instead of having the actual trumpet, we call the shofar by the name of the trumpet. We call it a chatzotzrasa to memorialize the chatzotzos in the Beis Hamikdash. Regarding the arava, we know that in the time of Beis Hamikdash, not only did they take the arava and pick it up together with the lulav, it was actually placed around the mizbeach as well. So it was used as some form of carbon, of akrava. We don't have that any longer. So meant to make a zikaron today, and we call our arava with the term tzafzafa. Why? Tzafzafa can mean like tziftzaf, chirping. The words that we express, as Chazal tell us, instead of the karbanos, we have our words. And Rishalma parim, we compensate for the parim of the karbanos with tzfas, saying it with our lips, with the words that we express with our tefillos. So instead of having the arava, the carbon, the arava that they place around the mizbeach, we have merely tzafzafa. We use our words, our tefillos, which are meant to substitute for those karbanos. And finally, the psara, the large table, today we call it psarta, which means to say that even our large tables are merely considered to be small in reference to our father's table that we're missing. We used to eat off our father's table. We used to eat al shulchan aviyam, the Beis Hamikdash, the mizbeach. We were sustained by our father's shulchan. So today, even our large-sized table is merely referred to as a psarta, a small table. And by doing so, we memorialize, we remember, we make a zikaron, a zeichel lemigdash, to the shulchan, to the large table, the true large table, the table of our Father, which we experienced during the presence of the Beis Hamikdash. So we have three items whose names were switched around. Amar Abaye, I'm going to add another one. Af anu noimar, huvlila bekasi avlila. Rashi explains this is referring to two organs in the animal, part of the digestive tract, and the uvlila was the hemses. This was a circular compartment. One of the it was near the Beis HaKoises. Rashi says it aided in the digestion of the food, and this hemses, this uvlila, had one lining. There was another compartment called Beikasi, Beis HaKoises, and that had a double lining. Abaye tells us that we must pay close attention to the the way people are referring to this organ. Meaning, what used to be called Hovlila, which was the compartment which only had one lining, one wall, today is referred to as Beikasi. Okay? What used to be called Beikasi, which had the double lining, today is called Hovlila, which is the same word referred to the single line compartment of the old days. So now they switch things around. What is the nafkamina here? Why do we need to know this? For the halachos of treifos. So we find a needle stuck in the wall of the Beis HaKosos. So the Beis HaKosos, the initial Beis HaKosos, the one that used to be called Beikasi, which had the double lining. In that case, we find a needle. It depends how deep, how much the needle penetrated. If it's only mitzad echad ksher, if it only penetrated one of the linings, it's still kosher because the other lining is still blocking the hole. But if it protruded, it worked its way through both linings, then indeed it's considered to be a treifa. Therefore, Abaye tells us that today the hovlila, the Rashi calls it the hemses, the one-line, the single-line compartment, is called Beikasi. Is given a name of Beikasi, but even though it's not really the Beikasi of the old days, it's the single-line compartment, and therefore, if you find a machat there, it is considered to be treifa. However, what today is called hovlila, that indeed is the Beikasi of old. It is the double-line compartment. In that case, we find a machat which simply is penetrating one of the compartments is still kosher. Only if it penetrates all the way through, it's considered to be treifa. So it's important to know the right reference and the right terms. Amar Avashi, we're going to add another one to the list. Af Anonoima, Bavel Bursif. What used to be called Bavel, today is called Bursif. Bursif is called Bavel. Lamai Nafkamina, what is the halachic ramification here? Legite Nashim. For Gite Nashim, for a get, Rashi explains that we know that a get is meant to be written lishma with the intention of being used to divorce this woman. And the Chacham were concerned about the people in Chutz La'aretz that weren't so learned, they weren't so proficient in these halachas. Therefore, the Chacham were mesakin that an emissary shliach who brings a get from Medina Sayam from Chutz La'aretz, he's meant to testify and say, "Befanai nechta, fanai nechta," it was written and signed in front of me. However, a get which arrives from Bavel, there's no concern there. The people in Bavel were bekian, they were proficient on account of the fact that there were yeshivas there, so they were learned people, and there's no takana of befanai nechta, fanai nechta. Says the Gemara, we need to know where this get is coming from. If in today's terms it's coming from Bavel, then we know it's not from Bavel because they switch things around. It's really coming from Bursif, an entire different location. And we must use the term we must say b'fanechta, fanechta. If it's coming from Bursif, then we know it's truly coming from the Bavel of old, and there's no takana of b'fanechta, fanechta. Taisus has Rashi brings another pshat. He says that there's another nafkamina, legite nashim, for the name of the city. We want to know exactly where the people reside, because in the get we record the name of the city, of the ish, of the isha. So we want to know exactly what city it is. We want to write the city that they're residing there now. Meaning, if they're residing in Bavel, so in today's terms, we're meant to refer to it as Bursif. If they're residing in the Bursif of old, we're meant to record in the get the name Bavel. Tosfos says, Ein nira l'Rashi. He disagrees with Rashi because Bavel is the Shem Medina, the name of the entire country or province. It's not the name of the city. And in a get, we never record the name of the Medina. We only record the Shem of the year. So it's not relevant for recording in the get itself. The Rashash points out that indeed Bavel had two references. It referred to the Shem of the Medina, the entire province, entire country. But there was also a city. It was actually a city that was called Bavel. So indeed, when Rashi says that Bavel needs to be recorded in the get as describing the name of the city where they reside, indeed, he's referring to the Bavel, the city of Bavel, not the Medina of Bavel. Hadron Allah Matlikin continues the Mishnah. Kira Shisuko Bekasha Gvava. Now, a short introduction here. The Mishnah, the Sugi here is going to be discussing not Malachas Deraisa, not Bishul, which is a Issa Deraisa, a biblical prohibition, but rather we're going to be discussing Isur D'Rabbanan, specifically the Gzera of Shama Yechata, we discussed this earlier, the Chacham were concerned that if there is a pot with food on a flame on Shabbos, he's going to go ahead perhaps and stoke the flame, stir the coals to hasten the cooking process, to expedite the cooking. And therefore that would certainly be a malacha. That's a malacha of mavir. He's igniting the fire. So Chacham applied all types of restrictions and guidelines in order to avoid, to allay the concern that somebody will go ahead and be machata begecholim, who will stir the coals on Shabbos. Continues the Mishnah. Kira, this is a certain type of stove. Rashi says it was formed like fashioned like a keder, like a large pot, a tub, and they would place inside this kira, they would place the fuel, the wood, etc., and they would place the pot of food in there as well, or on top of it, to cook. So the Mishnah gives us various guidelines with regard to the Gzera of Shama Yechat. Says the Mishnah, it depends. It depends what type of fuel is being used. It depends what is being cooked. It depends in what type of format. Is he merely leaving it there? Is he taking it off and putting it back? There are different guidelines. There are different details regarding the Gzera Shama Yechat, when it applies and when it doesn't apply. Continues the Mishnah, Kira Shesikua Bekasha Gvara. So you have this kira that was fueled using flimsy type of fuel, kash, straw, begvava. Rashi says ishtubla, stubble, some sort of hay or wood chips that were gathered from the field. So these types of fuel, they burn out. They don't leave coals. There's no concern of Shama Yechata. Once the fire subsides, there's nothing to stir. So indeed, if he used these types of fuels, kira sheisikoa bekasha begvava, noisnum aleh tafshel, he may place a tafshel food on the stove. There's no concern that it's going to go ahead and stir the coals, because there won't be any coals present. Begefes or be'etzim, but if he uses a higher form of fuel, gefes be'etzim, so etzim is wood, gefes is the pulp of the crushed olives or crushed sesame seeds. So these types of fuel, they provide heat. They form into coals, and they last longer. They're more enduring types of fuels. In this case, there's a concern that he might go ahead and be machata begecholim lo yitin achiyigroif or yachitin sefer. In this case, he may not place the food on the stove until he addresses the concern of Shama Yechata. How's he going to do that? He can't leave these coals out in the open, exposed. He must do one of two things. Ad sheyigroif, until he shovels them aside. Some say means that he completely removes them removes them from the kira. Some say that he pushes them over to the side, away from the pot. That's ad sheyigroif, he shovels them. Or he has another option, ad sheyitin sefer. He places some ashes over these coals. By doing so, he cools them off. He demonstrates that his lack of an interest in stirring them. So that is a heter that would allow him to leave to have the food remain on the stove. There's no concern that he's going to go ahead and stir these coals. Now, what is he placing on the kira? Is it food? Is it liquid? We have a machlokes b'sham b'sil. B'sham, this discussion only pertains to chamen, hot water. Avaloi tafshel, but not to food. Why? Indeed, what is the difference between chamen, hot water, and a tafshel and food? Because a tafshel requires much more effort to get it cooked. And therefore, there is a concern that he's going to interfere with the process. He's going to hasten the proceedings by stirring the coals. However, chamen, hot water, it doesn't require much to get it fully cooked. And therefore, according to Beis Shammai, there is a difference between the two. This allowance to have something placed on the stove, whose coals were shoveled or covered with ashes, this applies merely to chamen, but tafshel does not have that allowance. Now Taisus points out that Beis Shammai's prohibition applies even to a tafshel, which was in a special called tzarka, which was fully cooked. Even so, explains Taisus, that food, it keeps on improving with the cooking process. Even if it's fully cooked, its flavor gets enhanced, it gets improved even after it is a special called tzarka, and therefore, according According to Beis Shammai, there too, there is a concern of Shamei Chata. He's going to want to improve on it. However, with regard to Cham and hot water, once it cooks, there's no improving on it. Therefore, there's no concern of Shamei Chata by Chaman. Continues the Mishnah. So that's Beis Shammai Shita, Chaman Avaloi Tavshel. Ubeis Hillel Aimrim, Chaman v'Tavshel. Both may be placed on the kira. There's no concern of Shamei Chata because he shoveled away the coals or he covered them. Concludes the Mishnah one more machlokes between Shammai and Hillel. Beis Shammai Aimrim, Noitel Avaloi Machzirin. Once you remove the pot off the stove, you cannot return it. You cannot actively place a pot on a kira on Shabbos, even if the coals were covered or shoveled away. Why? Because he's actively involving himself in the cooking process. Rashi says it's mechzikim avasha. It looks like he's cooking something. Other Mepharshim explain because when the pot was off the stove, perhaps it cooled down a bit, and when he's going to go and put it back, he's going to see that it's cooled off. He's going to want to reheat it again. There's a concern of a malacha here. So according to Beis Shammai, once he removes the pot, he cannot return it back to its original location. He can even return it to the kira, provided, once again, that the coals were shoveled or covered over with ashes. So in summary, the Mishnah is discussing the concern, the gzer of Shamei Chata. We're discussing a kira, some type of stove. May one have food on it throughout Shabbos? The Mishnah begins, it depends what type of fuel we're using. If we're using those flimsy kash v'gvava that die down, as soon as the flame dies down, they're gone, they don't generate any coals, there's no concern, Shamei Chata, and that is mutter. If he's using more significant forms of fuel like the gefes and the eitzim, which form coals, in that case, says the Mishnah, you must address those coals, you must shovel them away, you must cover them to indicate your disinterest in getting involved in stirring them. We have two disputes between Shammai and Hillel. According to Beis Shammai, this allowance is only for hot water. Tavshel does not have this allowance. According to Beis Hillel, it applies to both. And finally, Beis Shammai tell us, you may not actually place something on the kira. You can't return something which you took off. According to Beis Hillel, you may be machzer as well, provided once again that you address those coals by shoveling them away or covering them over. Continues the Gemara, Iboilu, they had a shiloh. Now a small introduction perhaps is in place here. We learned earlier in Masechas Shabbos that we do allow one to leave food by the coals, pot in the oven, provided that it's fully cooked. In that case, there's no concern of Shamei Chata. Or if it's raw, in that case as well, there's no concern that he'll go stir the coals. Because in both cases, he has no reason to do so. If it's fully cooked, there's no point. If it's raw, he's Mesiach Das. He knows it's not going to be edible until perhaps tomorrow. If so, there's no point in meddling. The Gemara told us the Gzera of Shamei Chata, the concern that he'll go get involved in expediting the cooking process, is only when it's bashal, it's partially cooked. In that case, he's going to want to hasten the process by stirring the coals and stoking the flames. Now, we learned that according to Chananya, even if the food is a third cooked, you've cooked it up to the point that it's a third of its normal cooking time, at that point, according to Chananya, there's no concern of Shamei Chata. Why? Because it's considered to have been rendered edible. That is called a machol ben drusoi. Ben drusoi was this bandit who would eat his food in this manner due to his the uncertainties of his profession. So evidently it's considered to be sufficiently edible, and it has a din of mevushal, and therefore it has the same halacha of mevushal called tzarkoi. One may place it near the coals, in the oven, etc. There's no concern of Shamei Chata. That was the sheet of Chananya, which we discussed back on Daf Yotes. And the Mishnah there seemed to be following that sheet of Chananya, that one may have food present on top of a stove, in an oven, air cold, etc., when the food was a third cooked. There's no concern of Shamei Chata. So the Gemara here wants to know whether our Mishnah is following in accordance with that opinion as well. Whether Shehiyah, having something remain on a stove over Shabbos, is allowed when that food item has already been a third cooked. So what is the discussion in our Mishnah? Is our Mishnah discussing Shehiyah and providing all types of restrictions and guidelines? And apparently, our Mishnah is not following Hananya, who allows Shehiyah without any restrictions. Or is our Mishnah discussing a different topic altogether? The Mishnah is discussing placing something on a stove, Chazara. After you remove the pot, can you put it back? Can you return it to the stove on Shabbos itself? That's a more stringent form of activity. That's actively getting yourself involved in the cooking process, placing something on the stove. And that's why we have all these types of restrictions of covering, of shoveling the coals, because he might come to get more actively involved in the process by stirring the coals. Or as Rashi says, because it looks like he's cooking something on Shabbos. So let's take a close look at our Mishnah. Is our Mishnah discussing Shehiyah and is opposed to Chananya's heter? Or is our Mishnah discussing Chazara and it's unrelated to Chananya? Shehiyah? That surely is allowed according to the Shita of Chananya, in accordance with the Shita of Chananya. Ibaylu, says the Gemara, we asked the following question. So the Bnei Yeshiva wanted to know as follows. Ibaylu, they asked as follows. Hi lo yitin. When the Mishnah tells us lo yitin, we may not place. What does it mean? You may not put. Lo yachzer? It means you may not return the item back to the Kira on Shabbos. And that's why there are all types of restrictions. You may not do so unless you cover the coals, you shovel them away. Because Chazara has all these types of concerns of Shemei Chata. Abo lishis, but merely to allow it to remain on the stove from before Shabbos. You place it there before Shabbos, it's just sitting there on Shabbos, that's called Shehiyah. Mashin, that is allowed, even though the coals were not shoveled away. And they were not covered with ashes. Kata means is a lashon of afer, that the coals were not covered with afer. So even though it wasn't garf, it wasn't shoveled, ve'enu katan wasn't covered with ashes, Shehiyah is allowed. Umani, who is this following? Whose shita are we concurring with? Chananya, the Tanya Chananya Omer. Kol shu kamacha b'drisoi, when we have food which is already a third cooked. Mutar la'ashoyse al gabekir. It may remain on top of a kira throughout Shabbos. Aval pi she'enei gorov ve'enei katan. So is this Mishnah following Chananya or not? So one side of the coin is yes. This Mishnah concurs with Chananya. Shehiyah is mutar. In the case when it was the third cook, there's no concern of Shemei Chata. The restrictions of our Mishnah are referring to an entirely different topic, a din of Chazara, when one decides to return the pot onto the Kira on Shabbos. That's more stringent. And that requires Grifa and Ktima. Oidilma, the other side of the coin is no. Our Mishnah disagrees with Chananya. Our Mishnah is discussing Shehiyah, and it provides all these guidance for Shehiyah as well. You may not just, there's no blank check for Shehiyah. You must remove the coals, you must cover them. And this does not agree with Chananya. When the Mishnah tells us, Lo yitin at she'igrif, you may not place until you shovel away, we're discussing Shehiyah. You may not even have it sitting there from before Shabbos. V'igor v'katam in, if it was shoveled and covered, yes, that's allowed. But otherwise it's not allowed, and this does not concur with Chananya. So Shehiyah is not allowed. V'koshken lahachsin, certainly, of course. Actually returning a pot onto the stove, that requires shoveling or covering. So we're not sure, is our Mishnah discussing Shehiyah and is opposed to Chananya's heter, or is our Mishnah merely discussing Chazar and has nothing to do with Shehiyah? Shehiyah certainly is allowed in accordance with Chananya's shit. Tashma, come and listen. Let's take a closer look at our Mishnah and see which way it reads. Midik tani trei bavi bimas nisan. Let's take a look at the latter part of the Mishnah, which brings for us two disagreements between Beisham and Mitzil. Beisham oimrim chamen avloi tafshel, that the halacha of the Mishnah pertains to hot water, strictly to chamen, and not to tafshel. Ubetzil oimrim chamen v'tafshel, even to tafshel as well. We have another machlekes. Beisham oimrim noitin avloi machzir. Once you take it off the flame, once you take it off the stove, you may not return it. Ubetzil oimrim af machzir, you may also return it, provided you complied with the instructions, you shoveled, you covered the coals. Says more, let's analyze the Mishnah. What is the Mishnah discussing? Shehiyah or Chazara? It's all good and well if the Mishnah is discussing Shehiyah. If so, this is how the Mishnah will read. The Mishnah begins. So the stove which was fueled using these flimsy, short-lived types of fuels, Indeed, one may have a food item sitting on this stove from Erev Shabbos. It may be present there throughout Shabbos. There's no concern of Shamei Chata when it is fueled with Gasha Gvava, which don't create coals. There's no problem. Big Gefes of Eitzim, however, Gefes and Eitzim which do produce coals, Lo Yisha, in that case, he cannot do Shehiyah. He cannot have something remain on the stove even from before Shabbos. He cannot have it sitting there on Shabbos. Until he shovels or places the ashes on them. And the Mishnah continues with regards to Beishamai B'Sil, Umayin Mashim. So we allow him to have something present on his stove, provided he shoveled, he covered. What exactly is he having there? What exactly is sitting on the stove? Umayin Mashim. This only pertains to hot water, which doesn't have the concern of Shamei Chater as much as Tafshil does. Avaloi Tafshil, certainly Tafshil can't, even if you shoveled or covered. Once you've shoveled and covered, you've addressed the coals properly, you may be Mashe, Chamin, or Tafshil. So Shehiyah is allowed by Chamin and Tafshil as well. So that's the first machlekes. The Mishnah proceeds with another machlekes. Just as they have a machlekes regarding Shehiyah, Peligi nami b'la'achsir. They also have a machlekes regarding Chazara. That a person has a kira, he addresses the coals, he shovels them, he covers them. Nevertheless, Beishamai say only Shehiyah is allowed, but Chazara is not allowed. That's an active ma'aseh. He's going to place something on the stove. There's a concern there. He can't do it. No, once he addresses the coals, af machzir, even Chazara is allowed. So, according to this approach in the Gemara, the Mishnah indeed is discussing Shehiyah. And let's take a look again at the various clauses of the Mishnah. The Mishnah began with a kira which was fueled using kasha gvava. One maybe masha. Shehiyah is mutter in this case. Shehiyah again means that he leaves the food from Erev Shabbos on the stove. So if he's using merely kasha gvava, there's no concern of Shamei Chata throughout Shabbos. However, gefes ve'etzim, which produce those coals, in that case, even Shehiyah is aser, unless he goes and addresses those coals. Yigroif, Itanefer, he shovels them, he covers them with ashes. The Mishnah proceeds with another halacha regarding Shehiyah, another detail. What can be left remaining on this stove throughout Shabbos? This heter of Shehiyah, what does it pertain to? According to Beishamai, it's very restrictive, only to hot water and not to tafshil. According to Beisil, it applies to hot water and to tafshil as well. And the Mishnah concludes with another machlekes, this one regarding Chazara. So according to Beishamai, even if he shoveled or covered those coals, Chazara is not allowed. According to Beisil, Chazara is allowed. So according to this approach in the Gemara, the Mishnah indeed is discussing Shehiyah and is not concurring with Chananya. The Mishnah gives us various instructions and restrictions regarding Shehiyah as well. You must address those coals. You must cover them and shovel them. Cover them or shovel them. So according to this approach, the Mishnah is discussing Shehiyah. Continues the Gemara. Elei amris lahachsitnan. However, if you propose that no, you're misinterpreting the Mishnah, you must interpret the Mishnah differently. Shehiyah is mutar in accordance with Chananya. The Mishnah is not discussing Shehiyah. There's no din to remove coals when he's merely doing Shehiyah. The Mishnah is discussing Chazar, which is more stringent than Shehiyah. But if you would like to propose that our Mishnah is discussing Chazar, not Shehiyah, and indeed our Mishnah concurs with Chananya, Shehiyah is mutter regardless. There's no need to shovel the coals by Shehiyah. It's only by Chazar. If so, let's take a look at the Mishnah. If so, this is how you're going to have to read the Mishnah. Let's start again from the beginning. So the stove which was fueled by kasha gvava, again we're discussing chazar. So chazar is allowed on this type of kira. One may return the pot onto the stove on Shabbos because kasha gvava don't generate coals. There's no coals to stir. The Mishnah continues. The Mishnah continues. But if he's using those fuels which generate coals, lo yachser, he may not actually return the pot onto the stove unless provided yigrav until he shovels, or efer until he covers it with ashes. And the Mishnah will continue with Beisham Besil. Umay Machzir. If so, what material, what type of item may he indeed do chazara on this stove which was shoveled or covered? Beisham Oimim Chamin. It's restricted to hot water, where the concern of Shamei Chata is diminished. Avaloi Tafshel. However, food is not allowed. Chazara on food is not allowed even when he shoveled or covered those coals. Ubesil Loimim no Chamin v'Tafshel. Chazara is allowed for both. Let's proceed to the next machlokes. Beisham Oimim Noitlan v'Lo Machzir. You may remove from this stove but not return. Now let's stop here for a second. We had a first machlokes where Beisham told us that chazara is only allowed by chamin. One may only return hot water, but not a tafshel. Now Beis Shammai continues and says the same thing again. Noitlan v'lo machzir. One may not return a tafshel. Evidently Beis Shammai is speaking about a tafshel, because chamin they allow, right? So Beis Shammai say Noitlan v'lo machzir. You may not return. What are they speaking about? Food, a tafshel. They've already said that. They're merely repeating their own words. Again, Beis Shammai Noitlan v'lo machzir, or Beis Hillel af machzir. You may even return. What's the point of repeating the same machlokes again? Sulamali. This seems to be merely a repetition of the first machlokes. Once again, the discussion was chazar. Beis Shammai told us chazar returning is only allowed for hot water, not for food. Beis Hillel say it's allowed even for food. And the next machlokes comes and says the same thing. Beis Shammai says chazara for food is not allowed. Beis Hillel say chazara for tafshel is allowed. It seems to be a mere repetition. So we have difficulty interpreting the Mishnah to be referring to chazara because the wording won't work, the sequence won't work. We won't understand why the Mishnah needs to quote to present both disputes of Beis Shammai and Hillel one after the other when they simply seem to be repeating themselves. Let's stop once again at this point and analyze the wording of the Mishnah in view of this most recent proposal. So the Gemara proposed that the Mishnah is discussing chazara. The Mishnah is not discussing shehiyah, because shehiyah is allowed according to the sheet of Chananya, and we concur with Chananya. The Mishnah is discussing chazara, which is more stringent. And therefore the Mishnah begins by telling us a kira which was fueled using kasha gvava, chazara is allowed. However, gefes ve'etzim, chazara is not allowed unless he shovels or covers the coals. The Mishnah continues and proceeds to tell us what food items are chazara allowed for. According to Beis Shammai, only chamin and not tafshel. According to Beis Hillel, both are allowed, chamin and tafshel, because he shoveled the coals or he covered them. But the difficulty will be, what's the point of the next machlokes, which seems to be a mere repetition? Once again, Beis Shammai says chazar is not allowed by tafshel. Beis Hillel says chazar is allowed by tafshel. You're repeating yourself. This can't be pshat in the Mishnah. Continues the Gemara. You know what? Let's stick to this approach, but we'll make a minor change. La'olam eimlach. Certainly, I'll tell you as follows. The Mishnah is discussing chazara and not shehiyah, because the Mishnah concurs with Chananya that shehiyah is mutter even without shoveling or covering the coals. The Mishnah is discussing chazara, which is more stringent. You must interpret the Mishnah as though it's missing some words, and this is how you meant to read it. Let's start from the beginning once again. We have the stove which was fueled using the kash and the gvava, those flimsy materials. The Mishnah is discussing chazara. Chazara is allowed on this kira. Why? Because the kash and gvava don't contain the coals, and there's no concern of stirring those coals. So chazara is allowed. However, if he used gefes and eitzim, the pulp and the wood, which generate those coals, lo yachser, in that case chazara is prohibited, because putting an item back on this stove on Shabbos carries with it a risk. There's a concern of shamei yechata b'gechol. So you may not do so unless he shovels those coals away, and he covers them with ashes. By doing so, he cools them. He indicates his disinterest in getting involved in those coals and stoking them and stirring them. So once again, we're discussing chazara. These restrictions pertain to chazara, which is more stringent than shehiyah. Avo, but this implies lishes mashin. However, to merely have something sit on the stove from before Shabbos, shehiyah is allowed. Avo b'she'enei garaf ve'enei kativ, even without shoveling and covering. And the Mishnah continues, umahin mashin. If shehiyah is allowed, what is shehiyah allowed? for? What item? We have machlekes b'sham b'sil. B'sham oimim chamen avlei tafshil. Hot water, that's okay. Shehiyah for hot water is okay, even without shoveling or covering the coals. But not tafshil, avlei tafshil, which requires more cooking, and there's a concern of shamei chata, even by shehiyah. U'b'sil oimim chamen v'tafshil. Shehiyah, that's mutter, even by chamen, even by tafshil, even if there's no grief or ktima, even if there's no shoveling or covering those coals. And indeed, this concurs with Shitas Chananya. Beis Hillel is in line with Chananya, who allows shehiyah even without shoveling or covering the coals. And the heter applies to anything, hot water or food. And the Mishnah will proceed and conclude with another machlekes, which relates back to Chazara. V'ha Chazara d'amrilach. So going back to Chazara, which was discussed in the beginning of the Mishnah, this discussion, this allowance to actually return the pot back to the stove, provided that he addressed those coals, he shoveled or covered them. This heter, this allowance, it's not acceptable on all. Not everybody agrees with it. There's actually a dispute between Bisham and Bishila. There's no heter to be machzer, even if he dresses the coals, even if he shovels them and covers them. There's no allowance to do chazara. We discussed this many times. Chazara is more chomer, it's more stringent. It's a maisa, it's mechzikim avashel. Perhaps the food was cooled off and he's going to reheat it when he brings it back to the stove. There's no heter of chazara, even when the coals were shoveled or covered. This allowance, this shoveling and covering of those coals, allows him even to return the pot to the oven. So let's take a closer look at the Mishnah again in view of this most recent interpretation. The Gemara maintains indeed that the Mishnah is in line with Chananya, because shehiyah is mutter. The Mishnah's restrictions apply to Chazara, which is not the topic of Chananya. And the Mishnah begins with a kira that was fueled using kasha gvava. Chazara in that case is mutter. There's no concern of shamei chata. Regarding Chazara on a kira which was fueled with gevet ve'etzim, over there, he must address those coals, he must shovel them or cover them. And the Gemara continues that this halacha is only for Chazara, but shehiyah, merely having a food item sitting on a stove from before Shabbos, that is mutter on Shabbos. There's no problem there. Why? Because there's no shamei chata there. We're following Chananya Shita. And on that we have a machlekes b'sham b'sila. B'sham say, this shehiyah, this heter, to allow something to remain on the stove throughout Shabbos is only with regards to cham and hot water, which doesn't require much effort to get it cooked, but not for tafshil. According to Beis Hillel, this heter applies to cham and to tafshil, and this certainly is completely in line with Chananya. The Mishnah concludes with one more machlekes. This machlekes pertains to Chazara, meaning, let's go back to the din of Chazara. Once he shovels those coals or covers them, Chazara is allowed. However, Beis Shammai don't agree with that. Beis Shammai say no, Chazara is never allowed. This heter in the Mishnah was only Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai holds to actively place something on the stove, to return the pot which was removed off the stove on Shabbos. That is not allowed. Chazara is never allowed. Beis Hillel maintain yes. Once he addresses those coals, he shovels them or he covers them, even Chazara is allowed. Not only do we allow shehiyah, and shehiyah is allowed even when the coals are still exposed, but even Chazara is allowed, as long provided that he addresses those coals, he shovels them or covers them. Okay, so it's time for a Chazara on today's daf. We began discussing the concept of muktzah with regard to a shofar or to a trumpet. We have three shittas. We have Rabbi Yehuda, we have Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Nechemia. Rabbi Yehuda differentiates between the shofar and the trumpet. He says a shofar is also meant to be used as a baby bottle. Therefore, one can use it for that purpose on Shabbos. A trumpet, by and large, the vast majority of its designation is for Melechas Isser, and therefore it cannot be used on Shabbos. Rabbi Shimon says both items are not muktzah, may be used for a Melechas Heter on Shabbos. L'tzorech gufay, he can use it if he needs it for a Melechas Heter, for a Shimush Heter on Shabbos. Rabbi Chemi says just the opposite. Rabbi Chemi maintains that a kli may not be used unless it is for its specifically designated purpose, specifically designated function. However, a shofar, a trumpet, is not meant to be used. It's not designated for uses other than its primary use. And since the primary use here is using it for a malacha, according to Rabbi Chemia, we view the shofar and the trumpet as a klisha malachte le'isr, and it's muktan Shabbos, since using it for a shemesh heter is diverting it from its primary use. Rabbi Chemia holds a kli is only nital on Shabbos le'tzorech ha'miyuchad loy, for its primarily designated use and nothing else. The Gemara continued with various phenomena, various items, names that were switched around: shofar and chatzoitra, arav and tzafzafa, psur and psurta, hovlila and bekasi, that was regarding treifus, and bavel and bursa, the names of those locations, which had a halachic effect on the halacha of a get. The Mishnah continued with the topic of the gzera shamiyachata. So there's concern that if one leaves food in an oven, he might go ahead and enhance and hasten the cooking process by stirring the coals. Now, the Mishnah gave us various guidelines to this gzera. The Mishnah began with the flimsy, with this short-lived fuel of the kash and gvava. There's no concern there, because since they don't generate coals. The gefes and eitzim, the pulp and the wood, generate coals. There's a concern there. He has to address that concern by shoveling it away or by covering it. We have two machlekes between Shammai Sil and the Mishnah. Shammai say this heter is only, this allowance is only for hot water, which doesn't require much effort to get it cooked. Tavshil, that is not allowed even if he shovels or covers those coals. The Mishnah concludes with another machlekes regarding chazara. Shammai say there's no heter of chazara. Once you take the pot off, you can't return it back to the oven. You can't restore it. According to Beisil, chazara too is allowed. The Gemara begins with a discussion of Hananya, who allows one to do shehiyah on a stove where the coals are still exposed, provided that the food was cooked. A third is considered to be edible. It's considered to have a status of mavushal, and therefore there's no concern of shamei. Because once again, the concern of shamei is only by partially cooked food. If it's fully cooked, why is he going to stir the coals? If it's raw, there's no point in stirring them. He's going to have to wait till tomorrow anyhow. The Gemara had told us earlier that it's only regarding partially cooked food that there is a concern of shamei chata. Hanani maintains once it's a third cooked, it's considered to be halachically mavushal, and there's no concern of shamei chata. The Gemara deliberated whether our Mishnah agrees or disagrees with Hananya. The Gemara began by saying, well, apparently our Mishnah cannot concur with Hananya, because if our Mishnah is discussing the halacha of shehiyah, and the Mishnah is giving us guidelines and restrictions, unlike Hananya, in dispute of Hananya's opinion, so the Mishnah works well, because the Mishnah begins by telling us that shehiyah is only allowed either by kasha gvava, where there's no concern of shamei chata, by gefes ve'etzim, which were addressed where the coals were shoveled or covered. And the Mishnah continued and told us that according to Beis Shammai, this heter of shehiyah is only by chamen and not by tafshil. According to Beis Hillel, it's even by tafshil. And the Mishnah concluded with another machlekes regarding chazara. According to Beis Shammai, even after he shovels or covers those coals, chazara is still not allowed, because chazara is more stringent than shehiyah. He's actively getting involved in the cooking process. According to Beis Hillel, even chazara is allowed, provided he shoveled or covered those coals. So if you maintain this approach on the Mishnah, it works well. It fits, it flows. And indeed, this Mishnah won't work with Hananya, because the Mishnah tells us that even shehiyah is prohibited provided he shoveled or covered those coals. Says the Gemara, because if you're going to maintain that our Mishnah is discussing not shehiyah, because shehiyah is allowed, our Mishnah is discussing merely chazara, how are you going to read the words of the Mishnah? Let's take a look. The Mishnah begins by saying chazara is allowed by kasha gvava, chazara is allowed by gefes ve'etzim, provided he shoveled or covered. Chazara is allowed, according to Beis Shammai, only by chamen and not by tafshil. According to Beis Hillel, by both. And the Mishnah concludes with a very strange sounding machlekes, where Beis Shammai says, chazara is not allowed by tafshil. Beis Hillel says chazara is allowed by tafshil. That is a repetition of the first machlekes. The Mishnah is merely repeating itself. It can't be that that's how the Mishnah is meant to be read. So if you say the Mishnah is discussing Chazara because Shehiyah is allowed, and according to the Hananiah Shita, the Mishnah is discussing Chazara, which is more stringent, and that's why we have restrictions, the Mishnah won't read. Says the Gemara, finally, yes. Let's approach the Mishnah differently. Let's view it with some missing words. The Mishnah indeed is discussing Chazara. Mishnah begins by telling us Chazara is allowed by Akira if it was fueled with Kasha Gvava that don't present a concern of Shamei Chata. Chazara is allowed by Akira which was fueled by Gefes Va'etzim, which do present a Chashash of Shamei Chata, but by shoveling or covering them, that allays that concern, that diminishes the concern of Shamei Chata. But this is all regarding Chazara. Shehiyah, that's allowed. One may leave a food item sitting on a stove throughout Shabbos, from Erev Shabbos, once again provided that it was at least a third cooked. That's allowed, even without shoveling or covering the coals. And the Mishnah proceeds, giving us another detail regarding Shehiyah. This is actually a machlokes. Beis Shammai holds Shehiyah is only allowed regarding Chamen. Beis Hillel say Chamen and Tafshil are allowed by Shehiyah. And the Mishnah concludes back with Chazara. This halacha that Chazara is allowed when the Gefes V'etzim were shoveled or covered, you should know that's only Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai say no, Chazara is never allowed, even if he addressed the coals, because Chazara is a more active Maisa. It's actively getting yourself involved in the cooking process. It's different than merely Shehiyah, which is just a passive act. However, Beis Hillel holds even Chazara is allowed. If one removed the pot from off the stove, and he's allowed to go and return it on Shabbos itself, provided that he addressed those coals, he shoveled them, or he covered them, which mitigates the concern of Shamei Chata. However, regarding Shehiyah, according to Beis Hillel, Shehiyah is allowed even by Tafshil, not only by Chamen. Chamen and Tafshil can remain sitting on the stove. There's no concern of Shamei Chata, and indeed, this concurs completely with the opinion of Hananiah.